Good morning. Ribhu Gita, the Song of Ribhu, chapter 25. The supreme liberation by the conviction of the pure Brahman. Verse 1. In order that the knowledge of the undivided supreme Brahman may be made firm and strong, in this discourse I shall speak to you again about the conviction of being the pure supreme. If you have that conviction as instructed, then the sankalpas, the concepts, and the vikalpas, the imaginations and the doubts of the mind, will cease without the least remnant. My son, if they are destroyed in the intellect that has eliminated sankalpas, the concepts, the fixed ideas, and the vikalpas, the doubts, the notions of difference, the imagination, the perfectly full knowledge shall arise. 2. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is mere consciousness alone. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is an expanse of consciousness. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is blemishless. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is without interspace. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is all reality. I am ever of the nature of Brahman, which is ever bliss. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is only myself. Be rid of the imagination, the doubts, with such constant conviction. 3. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is pure. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is the mass of bliss. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is eternal. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is taintless. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is reality. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is changeless. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is non-dual. Be rid of vikalpas, the doubts, the imaginations, with such conviction always. 4. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is without a beginning or an end. I am of the nature that is undivided, complete, and perfectly full. I am indeed of that nature which is without caste or lineage or any such thing. I am indeed of the nature of the attachmentless Supreme Brahman, which has no connections. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is differenceless and divisionless. I am of the nature of the fearless Brahman, which is unconcerned. I am of the nature of the one absolute, devoid of anything. Be rid of doubts and imaginations with such constant conviction. 5. I am indeed of the nature of the imperishable mass of knowledge. I am of the nature devoid of creation or destruction. I am of the nature that is the imperishable bliss. I am of the nature that has not an atom of ego. I am of the nature of the defectless Supreme Brahman. I am of the nature of the undivided Absolute, which has nothing low about it. Be rid of the vikalpa, the doubts, the imaginations, with such uninterrupted conviction. 6. being ever of such conviction alone about the one absolute in your heart, and being rid of all traces of doubts and imaginations of the mind in bondage, and immersed, undifferentiated, in the ocean of Brahman bliss, enjoying the ineffable bliss, and thus cutting asunder the endless bondage of mundane misery, be ever established as the undivided existence. 7. Be of the steadfast differenceless conviction that there is not an atom apart, that all is the undivided Supreme Brahman, and that divisionless Brahman is yourself. If you do as directed, you will always be happy. Be happy, be established in happiness. There's not an iota of doubt in what has been said. I say this in the name of Shiva. This is the truth. 8. There's not an atom of imagination at any time. There's never any mind that imagines. There never is samsara, the cycle of birth and death, in the least. There never is one involved in the birth and death cycle, in the least. There never is an atom of the world. There never is a lord of this world. Be of the conviction that there never is anything, and that all there is the supreme of the nature of awareness. 9. As the mind never exists, how can there be the appearance of the world, which is its handiwork? As there does not exist even an atom of the world, where does the talk of an insentient body exist? As the body, a defect of the mind affecting spiritual advancement, never is, where is the existence of ego? Be convinced that all is the supreme of the nature of knowledge, and that indeed am I. Thought and other such things never exist. The world, the individuals, and such never exist at all, even though they all seem to confront you. Even though they all seem to confront you. What exists in reality is the Absolute alone. Even though they seem to take place day after day, what really occurs is the ever-present Absolute. Without the Supreme, the mass of existence consciousness bliss, there's no substance or appearance for the world. 11. Apart from the support that is the undivided substratum, there is no separate existence for the superimposition. Apart from the shining of the undivided substratum, there's no separate shining of the superimposition. Apart from the joy that is the undivided substratum, there is no separate joy of the superimposition. Apart from the nature of the undivided substratum, there's no separate existence for the superimposition, ever. 12. Hence, have the strong conviction that whatever exists, whatever happens, and whatever looks lovable are all the differenceless mass of existence, consciousness, bliss, Brahman. Never entertain in your mind at any time the frightening attitude that this perishable body and such are myself, and that this world is apart from me. 13. The ignorant man who has the firmly held notion of differentiation, that this decaying body and such are myself, and that this world is apart from me, even if an honored Brahmin is indeed an untouchable who is ranked the lowest by caste. There's no doubt of this, hence even in a weak moment, never give way to such belief. 14. Be rid of the debilitating bondage of worldly existence by practicing so as to be unfalteringly in the rock-like conviction that nothing ever exists, that whatever illusory appearances are there are all in reality the mass of bliss, the supreme, and that I am ever that supreme, and thus devoid of the sense of yourself, abiding in yourself, Brahman alone. 15. Thought exists not, nor intellect, nor individuals. There is no world, no lord of the world, and not a trace of duality. All talk of its existence is just talk. Hence, son, with the conviction in the perfectly full Supreme Brahman, you should ever be of the incessant and committed conviction of non-duality, and thereby become liberated. 16. Dispel all doubt and imaginations by the conviction of the mind that there never is anything as the scene which appears before you. Never, never, never. That all appearances arising as this is of the nature of one complete, perfectly full, all-pervasive Supreme Brahman, and that immutable nature is myself. Thus instantly attain the great liberation. I indeed am of the nature of the partless. I indeed am of the nature of the blemishless. I indeed am of the nature of the mass of knowledge. I indeed am of the nature of the complete. I indeed am of the nature of that which alone is. I indeed am of the nature of the majestic. I indeed am of the nature of Brahman. By such conviction of the One Absolute, become liberated. 18. I indeed am of the nature of a mass of bliss. I indeed am of the nature of the pure bliss. I indeed am of the nature of firm existence. I indeed am of the nature of the divine. I indeed am of the nature of the self of all. I indeed am of the nature of the serene divine. I indeed am of the nature of the undivided absolute. By such conviction of the One Absolute, become liberated. 19. I indeed am of the nature that is devoid of ego. I indeed am of the nature that is the self. I indeed am of the nature that has nothing of this. I indeed am of the nature of the One Supreme. I indeed am of the nature that has nothing as mine. I indeed am of the nature of the Great. I indeed am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman. By such conviction of the One Absolute, become liberated. 20. I indeed am of the nature that is devoid of thought. I indeed am of the nature that is consciousness alone. I indeed am of the nature that is unattached. I indeed am of the nature that is the supreme fourth state. I indeed am of the nature that is without bondage. I indeed am of the nature that is without the least bondage. I indeed am of the nature that is higher than the highest. I indeed am of the nature of Brahman alone. By such conviction of the One Absolute, become liberated. 21. I indeed am of the nature that is the true Guru. I indeed am of the nature that is the good student. I indeed am of the nature of all. I indeed am of the nature of nothing. I indeed am of the nature that pervades everywhere. I am I indeed am of the nature of all pervading bliss. I indeed am of the nature of perfect bliss. I indeed am of the nature of eternal bliss. I indeed am of the nature that is myself alone. I indeed am of the nature that is the undivided Absolute. By such conviction of the One Absolute, become liberated. 22. I am never the explicit or the implicit. I am never sentience nor insentience. I am never light or darkness. I am never one or two. I am never the existent or non-existent. I am never anything that has awareness. I am ever awareness alone. I am ever the undivided Brahman. By such conviction of the One Absolute, become liberated. 23. I'm never the body or the senses. I'm never life or the inner senses. I'm never the mind or understanding. I'm never thought or ego. I'm never ignorance or delusion. I am indeed never the individual or the supreme or the world. I'm ever the undivided absolute. I'm ever only the one Brahman. By such conviction of the One Absolute, become liberated. 24. Whatever appears as apart from the Supreme Brahman is ever complete unreality. Brahman, the mass of existence, consciousness, bliss, is the only thing that is ever changeless. I indeed am that Supreme Brahman, which is differenceless, has none of these variations, and is the one complete, perfectly full reality at all places and at all times. By such uninterrupted conviction, become liberated. 25. I am indeed the completely blemishless Brahman. I am indeed the completely attributeless Brahman. I am indeed Brahman, which is completely the mass of truth. I am indeed Brahman, which is completely the mass of consciousness. I am indeed Brahman, which is completely the mass of bliss. I am indeed Brahman, which is completely eternal bliss. I am indeed Brahman, which is completely undivided bliss. I am indeed Brahman, which is completely pure bliss. I am indeed Brahman, which is totally pure. I am indeed Brahman, which is completely the mass of peace. By such continuous conviction, become liberated. 26. I'm ever of the nature that has nothing apart. I'm ever of the nature that is great. I'm ever of the nature that is delusionless. I'm ever of the nature that is the undivided Brahman. I'm ever of the nature that is the undivided Supreme. I'm ever of the nature that is presently devoid of anything. I'm of the nature that is presently and ever devoid of anything. I am of the nature devoid of anything in the past. I am of the nature devoid of anything at all times. By such conviction, become liberated. 27. I am indeed of the nature that is without decay. I am indeed of the nature that ever shines as consciousness. I am indeed of the nature that is devoid of all conditionings. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme, which transcends everything. I am indeed of the nature of the indescribable Supreme Brahman. I am indeed of the nature of the perfectly full Brahman. I am indeed of the nature of the perfectly undivided Brahman. I am indeed of the nature of the undivided Absolute, untouched by ego. By such daily conviction, become liberated. 28. There are no holy waters apart from myself. There are no holy waters apart from the Self. There is no holy bath apart from this Self. Having a bath in the holy pure waters of the Self, with the understanding that I myself am the Self, and enjoying unsatiated, the undivided supreme bliss, which is the Self, always be established with utmost satisfaction and ever changeless as the Self, of the nature of the Supreme Brahman. By such daily conviction, become liberated. 29. There's nothing that is eaten outside the Self. The Self is all the food that is ever taken. There's not an atom outside the Self. The Self is all the sentient things that are. In the firm faith and conviction that I am the Self, and enjoying the bliss of the Self, the full satisfaction, fully and firmly established and abiding yourself as the Self, as yourself, of the nature of the undivided Absolute, be established ever unwaveringly. By such daily conviction, become liberated. 30. All the world and the beings that are an illusion superimposed on the Self are never apart from that Self. Even if they seem to be outside the Self, on proper inquiry, they will be found to be only that undivided Self. I am the Self. I am the Self. I am the Self. The Self is all. I am the Supreme Brahman. I am that Supreme Brahman. The Supreme Brahman is all. I am Brahman, which is not different from the Self. Ever in such conviction about the Self, which is the undivided Brahman, abide as that yourself. Being of such conviction, daily become liberated. 31. I am indeed the Self, which is the reality. I am indeed the Self, which appears as all. I am indeed the Self, which is eternally established. I am indeed the Supreme Self, which is attributeless. I am indeed the Self, which is existence, consciousness, bliss. I am indeed the Self, which has none of any duality. I am indeed the one, complete, perfectly full Self. And I am the non-dual Supreme Self. Being of such conviction daily, become liberated. 32. Having the conviction of the One Supreme with this firm certitude, and thereby being rid of all the doubts and differences and imaginations of thought, and with knowledge surging up, abide there, abide thereby as consciousness alone. Constant conviction is the prelude to the establishment in that nature. After being merged with that conviction, one can revel as oneself, with nothing apart. I am indeed the one complete, perfectly full Self. I am the non-dual Supreme Brahman. Being of such conviction daily, become liberated. 33. What has been told here, the undivided supreme conviction that all is Brahman and that I am that Brahman, is the most exalted, firm conviction. In addition, all those who practice such conviction will be rid of all the imaginations and differences of the fickle mind, and, abiding ever as the nature of the undivided Absolute, attain bliss. Abide ever in and as that bliss. There's not an atom of doubt of what has been said. One who listens and understands to what is expounded here will become the Supreme. 34. The several Vedas, in different texts of their various branches, call the one complete, perfectly full Supreme Shiva, the substratum of all the moving and unmoving, multifariously as Shambhu, Vishnu, Brahma, Indra, the god of fire, the god of death, the god of wind, and the various differentiated gods in different contexts. 35. If the supreme truth of the Vedas, which seem to talk of such diversity, is thoroughly inquired into, it will be seen that all the Vedas point only to the undifferentiated, supreme Brahman as their meaning. Thus did the sage Ribhu clearly teach Nidaga the conviction about the one Absolute. 36. It is the infinite form of our Lord of the whole of consciousness, dancing in supreme consciousness bliss, that says, all the world and others that exist as an illusory superimposition on that are entirely that supreme consciousness alone. By the complete conviction that I am that undivided supreme reality, that supreme consciousness, one can abide as the pure absolute oneself. So, with that concludes chapter 25. Have a great day. Bye bye.